Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Dan Pfeiffer.
All right, I want to start with some pretty big news from the Supreme Court this morning with a ruling that upholds the treaty that says nearly half the land in Oklahoma is a reservation that belongs to Native Americans. To give us a little more insight about what this means, we're joined now by Rebecca Nagle, an Oklahoma journalist and citizen of the Cherokee Nation, whose podcast, This Land, tells the riveting story behind this case and what's at stake. Rebecca is releasing a bonus episode of This Land next week, where she'll talk more about all of this. But for now, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So big day, good day. For those of us who haven't had a chance to dive into This Land yet, can you give a quick summary of what this case was about and what was at stake here?
Yeah, so the case was brought by a man named Jim C. McGirt, who was convicted of crimes by the state of Oklahoma. He is a tribal citizen, and his crimes happened on the reservation of Muskogee Creek Nation. And so he appealed his conviction all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that Oklahoma did not have the jurisdiction to convict him because his crimes happened on a reservation that Oklahoma for the past century has acted as if it no longer existed. And so that was really what the thrust of this case was, is does Muskogee Creek Nation, and by extension, a total of 5 tribes in eastern Oklahoma, still have their reservations, or because, so much time has passed, or it would be extremely inconvenient for all the white people who live there, is there some other conclusion that the courts can come to? And in a decision that did not hold back at all, Gorsuch wrote that basically, this land was promised to Muskogee Creek Nation, and that the Supreme Court was going to hold the government to its word.
Can you give us a bit of your reaction when you read the ruling this morning, since you have been investigating this, researching this, following this for so long?
Yeah, I mean, I woke up this morning very emotional and not with a sinking stomach in my gut. I think throughout history, Indigenous people in this country, the government has just invented new reasons and new ways to take away our land. And so I was crying while I was brushing my teeth. I was ready. I was already full of rage and sadness. And then the second the decision came out, the first thing I looked for actually was who wrote it. And when I saw that it was written by Gorsuch, I started crying, and it was really emotional. It's been really dry here, and for people who know eastern Oklahoma, we get a lot of rain, and all of the grass in my lawn is dead. It's just been very dry. And right around the time that the decision came out, it just started pouring, and I'm going to start crying, but it's just, over the course of history, we have really just asked for the United States to follow its own laws, its own constitution, its own set of laws that govern our rights and our land rights. And so rarely it does. And so it's just such a big win when people in power, use that power the right way.
And for those of our listeners who haven't yet listened to This Land, could you explain a little bit about why, when you saw that Gorsuch, a usually very conservative justice, was writing the majority opinion, that was what made you realize that the ruling went the right way?
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to Indian law, you can't talk about parties. Native Americans tend to be Democrats, and Democrats tend to support Native issues. But, I think a really good example is that we have 4 Native people in Congress right now. 2 of them are Democrats and 2 of them are Republicans, And so, Gorsuch is what people call a textualist. So he looks at the law, he looks at the plain text of the law, and he interprets that. And the plain text of the Constitution, the plain text of these treaties says that this land is still reservations. And a lot of textualists don't apply that to treaties and to laws governing Native rights. But Gorsuch does, and he does it uncompromisingly. And so, I think that him being added to the Supreme Court, if we can keep Ginsburg, on our side, we might actually, for the first time in U.S. history, see a court that tends to rule in the favor of Native rights. We, throughout history, have basically lost the majority of time that our rights have gone up against the Supreme Court.
Well, on that note, I mean, what, if anything, will change as a result of this ruling, and what other cases involving Native rights do you have your eye on now?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, I mean, what's funny about this historic ruling and what's going to change on the ground is that the answer is actually very little. So, the Supreme Court has actually really limited tribal jurisdiction over both non-Indians on reservations and land on reservations that's also owned by non-Indians. And that's, the majority of the residents and the majority of land on these reservations. And so, for folks who, live in Jinx, Oklahoma, like, their life is going to go forward without much difference. I think what it really changes for the tribes is that, we have been losing land and losing restricted status on our land for over a century. It's just been the slow bleed of the laws that Oklahoma set up when it was created as a state. And so I think that this really affirms our sovereignty and lets us rebuild. I always talk about, like, in Cherokee history, everyone points to the Trail of Tears as, the most traumatic moment in our history. But from that moment, we rebuilt. Actually, the period of Cherokee history right after the Trail of Tears is called the Golden Era because we flourished in our new land. But then when Oklahoma was created on top of our land, it was divided up. We were preyed upon. Our land was stolen. Like, we have never fully recovered from that history. And so I think of this decision as a opportunity for our tribes to start to rebuild with our sovereignty and our land rights finally being recognized.
So one last question before I let you go. What are some of the things that people can do right now to ensure that this national focus on systemic racism and injustice includes Native rights?
Yes. Yeah, I think that that's a really, really important point because I think that one of the ways that anti-Indigenous racism functions is erasure, right? And so it's like, to everybody listening to this podcast, I would challenge you to name the people whose land you live on. Name an important Supreme Court decision throughout history that's not this one that impacted Native rights. Like, you've probably never heard of, Oliphant or the Marshall Trilogy, these like foundational things. And so I think that that invisibility is absolutely why we get Supreme Court decisions that make no sense and rule against tribes all the time. And so I think it's really an opportunity for people to both educate themselves and also to, consistently do that, for it to not just be, this moment or this flashpoint, but for it to be something that is an everyday part of the media and the news that people are consuming.
Very good advice. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for making This Land. Everyone go check it out if you haven't already, and be on the lookout next week for a special bonus episode of This Land. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Rebecca Nagle, good day. Thanks for being here for part of it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so Dan, the other major piece of news from the Supreme Court this morning that we should just briefly mention: the justices rejected President Trump's argument that he has, quote, absolute immunity while he's in office, and opened the door for prosecutors to obtain his financial records. The court actually ruled in two cases, one involving Manhattan's district attorney, the other House Democrats. While the ruling clears the way for Manhattan's DA to pursue a subpoena for the records, the case is going back to a lower court, and Trump's records are probably going to be kept secret under grand jury rules until after the election. In the other case, the one that involved the congressional request from House Democrats, the court basically pushed things back to a lower court and ruled that the House can't have access to the same records for now, citing some issues that have been unresolved about the separation of powers. Trump took the news very well this morning, rushed to Twitter to complain about how unfair the court was to him, threw in some other grievances about the Mueller hoax and Obamagate. He wrote, "This is all a political prosecution. I won the Mueller witch hunt and others, and now I have to keep fighting in a politically corrupt New York. Not fair to this presidency or administration." Dan, you have any reactions to the other rulings from this morning?
Well, I think These rulings are good for the rule of law over the long term. Like, we shouldn't have to point out that presidents are eligible for criminal prosecution if they are suspected of committing crimes, and we shouldn't have to point out that they are not immune from congressional oversight. But it is, I think these rulings are a loss in the sense that the way the Supreme Court very specifically wrote this, it is going to deny voters the ability to know what, if any, conflicts of interest Donald Trump has before they have to vote in November.
Spoiler alert, he has some.
Yeah. I mean, you can just presume. You can presume. I guess the real political upside is...
Plenty of evidence points to the idea that, yes, he does. He has plenty of conflicts of interest. He is plenty corrupt.
Yeah. It's a blank canvas, thanks to the Supreme Court. That's the other way of thinking about it.
I do think it does leave him open. Hopefully, if Joe Biden wins and he leaves office and Donald Trump leaves office, it really does open him up to prosecution in the Manhattan DA case, I think, which is something that, we can all look forward to because we care about the law. We care about justice being done. That's why. All right. Let's get to some other news of the day. Dan, on last week's episode, we answered a listener question about schools reopening this fall. It's a very challenging issue for kids, teachers, parents, the economy. Kind of issue that, really, really deserves thoughtful debate grounded in science. But we live in Donald Trump's America, so shortly after the CDC released guidelines for safely bringing students back to school, the president jumped on Twitter on Wednesday and accused the agency of asking schools to do very, quote, tough, expensive, and impractical things, threatened to cut funding for schools if they refuse to just open, and accused Democrats of wanting schools to remain closed for political reasons. Later in the day, Vice President Mike Pence said that the CDC would be issuing new guidance for schools and that the White House would be, quote, looking for ways to give states a strong incentive encouragement to get kids back in school as Congress takes up this next round of pandemic relief. So, Dan, here is just some of what the CDC proposed in their original guidelines that sent Trump spiraling. Desks at least 6 feet apart and facing the same direction, lunch in classrooms instead of a cafeteria, staggered arrival times, cloth masks for staff, and daily temperature screenings for everyone. What's Trump's problem with all that?
It's not clear what his problem is. It's very common sense. This is a very complicated issue where we have very little information. And so I want to try to separate various parts. One, the things that the CDC is asking are not on paper hard, but because we have been underfunding public education for decades in this country, many classrooms are overcrowded. And so 6 feet apart is not an option in many, many, many classrooms, right? So, because we are in the middle of a pandemic and the economy has gone through the floor, there is not money for testing, right? We have not, and I think perhaps most importantly, we have not spent the many months since we began responding to the coronavirus to prepare for this moment. The federal government has done essentially nothing to help school districts do this. And so Trump has sort of woke up, school starting in a few weeks, and realized that there is no plan and there's nothing to do. So he just wants to shove kids into schools without a plan to make it safe for both the students, but also the teachers and everyone else who works in a school.
Let's go back to so I guess the threat of cutting funding for schools from the Trump administration is not really going to help this situation in any kind of way.
Well, it's also not real, right? 90% of funding for schools is state and local.
Right,
and
that's what I was going to say.
Trump
so there's a question he can't really do. I mean, there is I guess we should say that in terms of pandemic relief, and there is some money for schools in the last round of relief, and there will be money. There has been money proposed for schools in the current relief that they're going to be debating over the next few months. So there is some thought that the Trump administration could play around with that, but certainly most of the money that schools get is from state and local governments.
Right. This is all the overwhelming majority of Trump threats. This one is not based in reality.
Right. Why do you think Trump's picking this fight right now?
He's desperately looking for a fight. Right. He is a man who he only thinks of politics in the context of wedge issues. And this is a really, really hard thing for parents. Right. People who have been working from home, with kids that is essentially an impossible situation, right? And and if you talk to any parent of young children, the idea that their kids will still be home doing distance learning throughout the fall is devastating. And it's devastating for their ability to just to be functioning adults and to do their jobs. And it's devastating for their children because all the study shows the distance learning thing is basically impossible. It is very limited impact. And I think unlike previous fights that Trump has picked about the opening of the economy and masks and things like that, he has some backing on his side, right? The Academy of Pediatrics have recommended that schools open, if with some caveats about safety. But there is a belief that schools need to open both for children and for the well-being of children, both in the short term and the long term, and for the economy, because the economy cannot open if people's kids can't go to school because people can't work. And so he's looking for a wedge issue. I think he's making the same mistake he's made on every part of this, which is just by looking for the issue, he's simply revealing that he has not done the work it takes to solve the problem.
So, I mean, thinking that it's obviously not just Trump that wants schools open. The American Academy of Pediatrics also issued guidelines on how to safely reopen schools. I guess the question is, I always like to play the game of what if we were in a normal administration that was not Trump and we had this challenge of opening schools safely in the middle of a pandemic that has not died down? What would it look like to open schools safely? And where should Joe Biden and the Democrats be on this one?
Well, I think that just like with the economy, that Joe Biden and the Democrats should work to avoid Trump sort of bifurcating the issue on he's for opening schools and Democrats are for closing schools. Because that's not their position, right? It's open without a plan or open with a plan. And so having a plan is the way to do it. I mean, and Democrats they have taken steps in Congress to have funding for testing, for schools to help them do this. There are a number of other ideas out there. So having a specific plan helps with that challenge. In a normal world, I mean, this is complicated by the fact that we know so little about this virus. We don't really, there's been I have read so much about this because our daughter, who's only 2, but under the normal course of business was planning to start in 2 weeks to go to a several day a week program for 2-year-olds. And you see all these studies about how kids have gone back to school in Europe and Asia and there have not been transmission of COVID. But also, and Trump made that point in his tweet. He said the schools are open in all these countries, but those countries did the work to contain the spread of the virus, and they're having a couple hundred cases a day. We're setting new records on a daily basis of coronavirus infections. And so what it looks like is, I think, ramping up testing, ramping up contract tracing, ramping up resources for schools. Emily Oster, who is a Brown economist and writes a lot of books for parents. You will soon read a lot of Emily Oster.
I've been reading Crib Sheet to prepare.
Yes, and she has an idea where you take young people, particularly college students who may be taking a gap year because their schools are not coming back in a full session, and hire them to work in schools. They're not trained teachers, but they can help facilitate activities and other things in order to sort of separate kids. So you can reduce the number of kids in a classroom at one time, because what put the limits on how you do social distancing are both room in the class and number of adults who can watch the kids safely. And there's a whole host of things you could do to get people to do it. You could surge funding to get surge Teach for America and things like that. But there is none of those things are happening. We did nothing, right? It's we, as a country, we made 2 fundamental errors, which is the whole point of flattening the curve is to prepare. And if we had really thought this through, we would have worked backwards from the opening of school. Because that is the thing. Because when the virus started, it was a couple months, then summer. And you could manage that, both from a kid's learning perspective and an economic perspective. And then so you would say everything we are doing is to reduce the spread to a manageable level and to prepare in terms of infrastructure and funding and teachers for opening of school. We did none of that. And then we did incredibly stupid things, which was we prioritized opening of bars and indoor dining over risk management to make it more likely that schools can open safely. And so it is a gigantic mess, and we have lacked any federal leadership, as evidenced by the fact that Trump is tweeting at his own CDC about their guidelines as opposed to picking up the phone and calling them.
It's such a mess. I mean, look, and this is in the American Academy of Pediatrics statement and guidance too. Like, there is evidence that obviously kids don't contract this virus as easily or pass it on as easily. Younger children, especially. But of course, there are people with sort of underlying conditions that you have to think about. There are teachers. There are older teachers. This is not an easy thing to figure out, even when you stipulate that distance learning is not only hard, but not nearly as effective and not doable for many middle class and lower class families. And so we do have this challenge. It's not an easy solution, but it does seem like you said that a normal working government would adequately resource schools, would make sure that would have also made sure that we don't have sort of out of control outbreaks in a lot of places where we have out of control outbreaks right now, because sort of having communities with lower transmission is probably the best way to guarantee that schools are safe. You could do, like you said, frequent testing of all students and teachers constantly. And then a contact tracing program where you isolate people who do catch the virus as fast as possible to cut down on the spread. You could have class from outdoor. You could open windows. You could do all these things. But we are, because of Trump and his mismanagement, in the situation we're always in, where it's going to become some political fight. Right? And it's just going to be like they want to have one side be for opening schools and one side for not being open for opening schools, when the reality is a complicated debate that takes science and education experts and parents and everyone to like sort of come together and figure out the best solution to a very difficult challenge. And that is where we are right now, and it is fucking infuriating.
I get the sense, John, it's only been 3.5 years, but bringing in data science as a way to solve complex problems is not necessarily in Trump's skill set.
Right. It's fucking brutal. All right. Let's talk about the Democratic Party, which may be on the verge of becoming, at least for this election, one big, happy, dysfunctional family.
Not even that dysfunctional.
Not even that dysfunctional. Well, there's always some dysfunction, so I had to throw that in there. First, some evidence from data guru Nate Cohn of the New York Times. In their most recent poll, voters in the battleground states who said Bernie Sanders was their top choice for president said they backed Joe Biden over President Trump 87% to 4%. Democrats who said Elizabeth Warren was their top choice in the primary backed Mr. Biden over Mr. Trump by a staggering margin of 96% to 0. Not a single Elizabeth Warren supporter to be found who's not backing Joe Biden. Dan, how did we get from all those contentious primary debates and Twitter wars to this?
Well, I think it is safe to say that the panic over a divided Democratic Party was even overstated at the time. And that is born of, we laugh about it, but the press is obsessed with the Dems in disarray narrative. And, and certainly there are some particularly loud voices on Twitter who drove that conversation in the run up to the ending of the primary, I would say. But it's also, the backdrop has changed, which is that this was always going to be an incredibly consequential and serious election, but it feels exponentially more with what's happening right now, right? The time to play around and sort of try to make a statement or whatever else with your vote feels so disconnected from what is happening. The idea, and the people who, this was a common refrain among a small percentage of, very small percentage of people, but a consequential percentage of people in 2016, which is Trump and Hillary are not that different, right? Just when you look at what has happened in this country since coronavirus hit, even if you had ignored everything that happened previously since Trump was elected, you just cannot, the consequences of having Trump and uniquely a Republican who hates government in charge of the government at a time of a pandemic and historical unemployment is so obvious that it pushes for unity. And I think the other thing is credit should go to Joe Biden.
I was going to say,
and all of his and his campaign and all of his opponents, most notably Bernie Sanders, for working incredibly hard to unify the party after this.
Yeah, there's a few things going on, and so it's hard to sort of cite any one factor as to what has changed, right? Like, we can't sort of rerun 2020 with Hillary Clinton as the nominee and say, okay, would it be different this time because people have seen what Trump is like for 4 years, and so they would be backing Hillary right now, much like they are backing Joe Biden. Like, we can't do that, but that could be a factor. Trump obviously could be a driving factor in all this. Nate points out in his piece in the New York Times how it wasn't quite like this in 2016. Some research suggests that up to 12% of Sanders' primary supporters ended up backing Trump in the general election. But then Nate points out that these voters tended to be relatively conservative, white, and rural, and didn't actually come back to Bernie in the 2020 primaries. What did you think of that point?
Yeah, I think that is certainly right, that there may be some number of people who were in, that we thought of as Sanders supporters in 2016 that we as Democrats have not seen since, right? Sanders' coalition was different this time, and it was a coalition that was much more liberal, much more uniformly liberal, and therefore more willing, it seems, to back the Democrat over the Republican.
Yeah. And like you said, I think there are differences in how the candidates and their supporters acted in 2020 versus 2016. And there was two big examples of sort of this inter-party dynamic of coming together has been playing out. Both happened on Wednesday. The first was when our good friend and activist Ady Barkan announced he'll be endorsing Joe Biden after finally landing an interview with the former vice president for Ady's series where he interviewed all the candidates in the primary. Here is a clip of that conversation between Ady and Joe Biden.
Vice President Biden. I can't imagine there isn't a moment that this campaign is not in some way bittersweet. Even though it sometimes feels impossible, I keep fighting for health care and doing the work I do for my son, Carl, and my daughter Willow. I just want them to be proud of me. From everything I have heard and read, your son, Beau, was an exceptional man. I am so sorry for your loss. If he were with us today, what do you think he would be saying to the American people? What would be his guidance in this difficult hour?
I hope he'd be saying that my father is totally authentic. Whatever he says he'll do, he will try to do. He'll never mislead you. When he makes a mistake, he'll tell you he made a mistake and take responsibility. And even if it's not popular, he will push things that he feels are a matter of principle, that relate to our values. I hope that's what he would say, because it is, my dad used to have an expression. He'd say, you know you're a success as a father if you turn and look at your child, realize he or she turned out better than you. When Beau died, Barack did the eulogy. He said Beau Biden was Joe 2.0. That's the whole thing. To be objective, have objective standards. I've been fairly successful, but my children have done better than I have done. Every day I ask, and I said the honest to God truth, and you'll be asking yourself too, how are my kids going to remember me? Are they proud of me?
That's why I do the work I do, to make sure that Willow and Carl are proud of me. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for this conversation. I am eager to do everything I can to help you win in November. And I look forward to having you as our president next year.
Dan, what did you think of the interview and Ady's endorsement?
I mean, I had to take a moment to collect myself before we could do this part, because obviously we've talked about Ady a lot over the last few years we've been doing this, and he is one of the most inspiring people that we've ever been around. And listening to him talk about how he is spending the last parts of his life doing this work for his kids and for every kid, it like gets me every single time. And then listening to Joe Biden talk about what drives him and how he has dealt with the loss of Bo, which is something that, I think it's unimaginable to anyone, but particularly to any parent, about what losing a child would be like, no matter how old they are, whether they're young or adults like Bo. And it's just, it's like, it's hard and inspiring all at the same time. And I think listening to Joe Biden there, what it makes me think about him and why I think he is uniquely positioned to lead this country at this time is, like Joe Biden sort of describes sometimes as like a regular guy, right? Like that's how politicians like to do it. Like, I'm from Scranton and I'm middle-class Joe. And like, and I think that is certainly true. And having known Joe Biden for a long time, like Scranton and his neighborhood of Claymont, Delaware, which, near where I grew up, like, I think those values are part of him. But it's not like Joe Biden regular guy. It's like Joe Biden regular human, right? He's a human who has his emotions and his flaws on his sleeve at all times, and they're there for the world to see. And he does think and wrestle with his own flaws and his own imperfections in a very public and I think reassuring way that is different than the way a lot of politicians handle it. And that came through in that interview. And like, obviously we're doing this in the context of a unified Democratic Party and having one of America's most important and most prominent advocates for Medicare for all endorsing Joe Biden on this day means something. But I think that conversation also revealed a lot about what is great about both of those men.
Yeah, and look, you say he's a regular person, but there's nothing regular, or at least there's nothing typical about the sheer amount of tragedy that he has faced in his life, having so many, immediate family members, losing so many immediate family members, and doing so while living a very public life as a public figure. And I think in a moment where the country's going through such tragedy and such loss, that does make him uniquely qualified in one way. I love the interview for all the reasons you said. I had always told Ady that I thought he would connect with Biden on that level, even as they disagreed. And what I also liked about the full interview, which you should all go watch, it's on Now This, and go to Ady's Twitter feed and you can see all the clips, is, they both stood their ground on what they believed too, and they weren't afraid to disagree with each other. And we know this because Ady's done this on the pod so many times. Ady was not afraid to press him. It was not just some softball interview where they pretended to get along and agree on everything. They went back and forth on Medicare for all, and Biden said how much he hated insurance companies too, and has had to deal with insurance companies. He's no fan of private insurance, but also thinks it's sort of the best way right now to get to full coverage. Talked about his public options, said that he'd be going further than he did in the primary, sort of nodded at more ideas to come, especially around providing for the option to have home care paid for and elder care paid for, not as part of Medicare, but just as a basic right. Also, when they were talking about criminal justice, Biden talked about banning no-knock warrants, which he's mentioned before, but also talked about redirecting some funding for police, even though he said he does not agree with defund the police. He's open to redirecting some police funding. And, there was one moment when I think, Biden talked about how he wants to propose like $50 billion for the National Institutes of Health. Ady said that wasn't enough. And then Biden said, well, if it's not enough, when I'm president, you come to me and we'll talk about it. We'll figure it out. And I do think that sort of reveals the kind of presidency that Joe Biden would offer. Like, it's not going to please progressives all the time, but there's always going to be a seat at the table for them. And he's always going to listen. And there are times when he's going to change his mind and agree with them. And there are times when he's not. but he's open and he listens, which I think is really important. And that sort of speaks to, I think, the other big news on this front yesterday was the release of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force recommendations. They were on 6 issues: the environment, criminal justice, the economy, education, healthcare, and immigration. The document with the full statements and recommendation is 110 pages long, so we won't go through it all. But here are some of the highlights. On healthcare, Biden now supports all low-income Americans would be automatically enrolled in either Medicaid or a premium-free public option government healthcare program. On climate, a commitment to carbon-free power by 2035 instead of his original 2050. On criminal justice, automatically expunging marijuana convictions. Didn't go so far as to favor federal legalization, but does leave legalization up to the states and decriminalizes. There's plenty more, but here's what Bernie Sanders said about the recommendations. This is from Bernie. He said, quote, "If implemented, they will make Joe Biden the most progressive president since FDR." That is from Bernie Sanders. Dan, what did you think of the recommendations? And are there any big ones that I missed that you found notable?
No, I don't think there's any big ones you missed. I think those are right. And I mean, those are the most important ones. I think it's the point you just made, which is the progress that was made demonstrates that Joe Biden is A, willing to listen, and B, he can be moved with activism. And so I think it is a message to everyone who cares about climate, Medicare for all, legalization of marijuana, that the work doesn't end on the day Joe Biden is sworn in. You can keep pushing him and keep engaging with him in good faith, and there is a real opportunity to make progress. And I think it is to the credit of everyone involved, both the Biden side and the Sanders side, that this process worked out the way it did. There were 1,000 potential pitfalls here where people could be unwilling to move on issues, and people were willing to compromise on both sides. And you end up in a world where you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeting about support for Joe Biden's climate agenda and what happened. You have the activists on side understanding, like, sanity reigned here. And I think it's really important progress, and people should feel good about it, because I think so often, when these working groups were first started, it's like, oh, it's a working group. It's going to be about as consequential as the platform, which doesn't really matter. But actual real progress was made. So the starting point on what Joe Biden's public option looks like when he gets to Congress and introduces it has become more progressive and more bold because of this work. The starting point for the conversation around what we're going to do on climate, both from his executive actions within his government to what happens in the House and the Senate, has moved to be more progressive because of this work. And I think that, that progress should not be discounted by anyone, even if people didn't get everything they wanted.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, some of the folks from the Sunrise Movement were tweeting about this yesterday, and I think so often we talk about these sort of unity task forces and coming together in terms of, building a coalition that can win the election. But it's clear that progress was made on a real substantive policy front that if Biden wins, will sort of pay dividends in a Biden administration. And when the Sunrise folks were tweeting about this, they said, we're really hopeful, not just because Joe Biden was a nice guy and accepted recommendations, but because we have built a movement that is powerful enough to compel potentially the next president of the United States to adopt some of the goals of that movement, which is a real, and AOC sort of said the same thing. It's a real recognition of the power of activism and the power of electoral politics, because I think we're at a moment right now where there's a lot of young people who are very progressive, but sometimes they are cynical for good reason about politics and public life and electoral politics. And this is another example, and Ady proves this as well. This is another example that when you mix activism with electoral politics, good things can happen and you can actually make progress. And it doesn't happen quickly, and there are setbacks, but it can happen.
The conversation we just had about the policy working groups and the polling are not disconnected, right? Which is, Joe Biden is in a commanding political position, both within his party and in the electorate. And so there could have been a world where he said, look, I won the primary. I won it by a lot. I am winning. I don't have to make any concessions, right? But there was compromise there, right? And there was a world where Sanders supporters could say, look, you're winning by a lot. We can, we don't have to give you our votes, right? Like there could be a 2016 redux in that situation, and everyone avoided that potential trap. And actual progress was made that if Joe Biden is elected, will make people's lives better. And that's all you can ask for.
Or, by the way, they could have said, we're for Medicare for all and we're for the Green New Deal, and those are our plans. And if you're not for those plans, we don't have anything else to talk about. And they didn't say that.
Yeah.
They didn't say that. So it's good on them as well. One more point on consolidating the Democratic coalition before we move on. It's not all optimism. Dave Wasserman from Cook Political Report noted that even though Biden is doing better among progressives and young people than Hillary did in 2016, he's actually doing slightly worse with non-white voters than she did, particularly with Latino voters. It's almost even with black voters, although not quite. But especially with Latino voters, Biden's winning them by an average of 30 points instead of 40 points. What's your reaction to that? What's going on there?
Well, as you know, I like to find things to worry about, so I was
that's,
pleased.
That's why you added that in the outline, of course.
Yes, it makes me feel more comfortable to sort of end this good news parade that I get from the rest of crooked media. I mean, I think we should all be concerned about it, right? Like, I mean, this is something I've written about recently, but this is Trump's strategy, is to shave Biden's margins with these elements of the Democratic base, right? And they're running ads right now. They're running ads in Spanish in Arizona and Florida and elsewhere in the country that accuse Biden of cognitive decline and not up to the task. They are running ads in Philadelphia and in other markets with a high proportion of African American voters about Joe Biden's criminal justice record in the 90s. Now, the Trump campaign is not super smart, so they're also running ads accusing Joe Biden of defunding the police in those same markets, in those same newscasts. So they don't really have a true strategy. But it is something that is concerning. And look, if the margins stay the same where they are right now, it's not going to make a huge difference. But there's a very real chance that Trump will, stabilize some politically, if not emotionally. And if that happens, then this can matter because, we talk a lot about Arizona, we talk a lot about Florida, but if you are significantly underperforming Hillary Clinton with Latino voters, you're going to have real troubles in those states because the difference between Hillary Clinton's loss and a Joe Biden win in Arizona is not just white people in the suburbs. It's also a effort to organize, register, and turn out Latino voters. Same situation in Florida. And Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin are states that went red in 2016, in part because of lower turnout among African Americans in those states. And so there is work to do here. There is time to do that work, but we should not take comfort in the fact that that Joe Biden's doing so well with other groups that he may not need these voters. That would be a fatal error in my view.
And I'll just say from doing the wilderness and talking to a lot of these voters myself in some of these states, these are not necessarily voters who are saying Joe Biden's too moderate for me. These are voters who, and this is what Stacey Abrams told me, this is what Cornell Belcher, who you've talked to for Campaign Experts React, had told me. This is what a lot of the organizers who are working with Latino communities in Florida told me, and this is what the voters themselves told me, is that these are voters who are very cynical about politics in general and distrustful of the system. And part of the reason they're distrustful, especially black voters, is because they know their votes have been suppressed in the past, that their voting rights have been restricted. And, the thing that always sticks with me is Cornell telling me that a lot of voters who voted for Stacey Abrams in Georgia in 2018 think, she won that race and she's not governor. Why should I even bother again? And reaching these voters, a lot of them are black and Latino and young, reaching these voters is really going to require the sort of, close, I would say in person, but it's in the middle of a pandemic, but really sort of intense organizing and relational organizing and talking to people one-on-one and talking to people who are friends and friends of friends. And this is really going to be the work of both the Biden campaign and their organizers, but sort of all of us who are working on Vote Save America and Adopt a State. And we're going to have specific calls to actions that were given to us by some of these groups that are working to organize Black and Latino voters in some of these states. I think that's going to be the real work of the next couple of months ahead of 2020.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also going to be, it's obviously organizing is a huge part of any and all political success, but you also have to give these voters a reason to believe why this time is going to be different. And
Yes.
that is certainly about how you're going to deliver on the promises that you make after decades upon decades of politicians not delivering on those promises. But it's also convincing people their vote's going to count. Like that's the big impact. Like that is the part of voter suppression that we don't pay enough attention to, which is sometimes you see just how explicit Brian Kemp was in Georgia in keeping people from voting. You're like, these guys are the least subtle criminals in history.
Yeah.
But the lack of subtlety is a feature, not a bug. They don't want to just make sure your vote doesn't count. They want you to know your vote's not going to count. The more explicit the voter suppression, the better, because that means the next time, why would you stand in line for hours upon hours, particularly at the risk of getting coronavirus, if we're probably just going to throw your vote out anyway, right? Or your machine's not going to work. And like, so, and for all the insanity we see around Trump's crazy vote by mail tweets, there is a purpose in that, right? And that is to convince Democratic voters who are, particularly African Americans and Latinos, who are skeptical of, for good reason, of voting and whether their votes will count, that they're unlikely to do so. And so there are a lot of elements of this, but this is something that all of us, right? This is not advice for Joe Biden time. This is for everyone up and down the ballot, every volunteer to think about how we can combat this, because this election is not, this election is, has a very real chance of being very, very close.
All right. One last item we were initially reluctant to talk about, but people have asked, so here we go. We're going to cover it really quickly, just to answer your questions. Kanye West has once again floated to run for the presidency. He was immediately endorsed by Elon Musk. This is the world we live in, Dan. In a wide-ranging interview with Forbes, which is putting it very generously, we have learned that Kanye would run as part of the birthday party, that he's never voted before, that he's an anti-vaxxer, that Planned Parenthood, he believes, is a white supremacist organization that does the devil's work, and that he's okay with siphoning off black votes from the Democratic nominee, even if it means helping Trump. Look, I don't want to sit here and analyze Kanye. Let's just answer the question. At this late point, can he get on the ballot in every state as a third-party candidate?
Can he? In every state? No. Can he get on the ballot in some states? Yes. Is it easy? No. Is it possible? Yes. Like, let me give you an example, right? In Michigan, we need to get 12,000 signatures by July 16th, which is in 1 week. And so that seems possible, but not probable. Some states are easier. Some states it's quite easy. As you may remember from Tiger King, Joe Exotic got on the ballot. So it is very possible that you can do that, but it's unlikely, I think. And he's not someone who has shown a ton of organizational follow through in recent years. So,
It looks like as of this recording on July 9th, it still doesn't appear that he is registered as a candidate with the FEC. According to publicly available records, a candidate by the name of Kanye D's Nuts West registered as a Green Party candidate in 2015, but is not reported raising any funds. He did already miss the deadline in North Carolina, Texas, New Mexico, and Indiana. And the states that have July deadlines, like Michigan, are some big ones. Colorado, Florida, Michigan, Missouri, Oklahoma, South Carolina, West Virginia, Maine, New York all have July deadlines. And if he doesn't make those deadlines, then you have write-in options, a write-in campaign, though that's quite difficult to impossible to pull off as well. So that's where we are on this.
I mean, here's what I would say. Do not pay a lot of attention to this yet. Do not worry about this. If all of a sudden Kanye starts hiring, if he registers as a candidate, without the middle name D's Nuts, or starts hiring organizers, then now it's time to at least pay attention to it. Before that, this is just sort of clickbait for people stuck at home. I would say that a plan where Kanye runs for president to siphon off black voters from Joe Biden is the exact sort of plan that Trump and Jared Kushner would come up with, because it's so obvious and so stupid and so likely to fail. But this seems to be more like Kanye sort of popping off as he is wont to do. And it potentially could be related to some sort of music project, sneaker line dropping or something like that. Because usually when he gets very engaged in the world publicly, it's because there's something that he wants to promote coming down the pike.
And we should say one last serious point on this related to third parties in general. And we've sort of made this point before, but the New York Times had another piece based on their poll about sort of third party candidates in 2020. A lot of pollsters are finding much less appetite for third party candidates this time around. That tends to happen during elections where there is an incumbent on the ballot. In 2004, when it was Bush versus Kerry, in 2012, when it was Obama versus Romney, the third party share of the vote in both of those elections was way, way down, around 1%. It's much different when it's an open election, like in 2016, then the third party share goes up. And I think also because so many voters have such strong feelings about Donald Trump, this incumbent particularly, pollsters are finding that when they give people the option to select a third-party candidate in a lot of polls, they are not doing so. They are actually choosing between Trump or Biden, or at least saying they're undecided between those two. So that's sort of the larger third-party landscape for everyone. That's a real point to make within this Kanye silliness.
Do you feel less good about yourself now that we've talked about this? Because
Yeah, of course. Of course. Yeah, I saw on Sunday morning, I was texting with Tommy about whether we should talk about it Monday, and we were both like, this is ridiculous. And then after a week of some of this coverage and it lingering out there, I was like, let's just answer it for folks and just, and then we can move on.
I've had a lot of people tweet at me asking them if this is something they should worry about. I kind of want to be like,
same.
We are in the middle of a pandemic. You can probably find something else other than this to worry about. But
right.
As we say here, at least as I say, worry about everything, panic about nothing. And that is true for Kanye as is true for anything else.
Thanks to Rashad Robinson for joining us. Thanks to Rebecca Nagle for joining us. And everyone have a fantastic weekend. And we'll see you next week.
Bye, everyone.